the house. Um, okay, so folks, good to see you all, and particularly great to see Simon. Simon and myself were reflecting on our last physical kind of meeting was during COVID. It was like a dreamlike state down in Sandyford Industrial Estate in the middle of a ferocious lockdown. It was a very surreal coffee we had, and we're looking forward to breaking bread when Simon is over next time. But Simon's been a great friend to us here in the Institute and has been very kind with his time. And indeed is a frequent visitors to our shores. For those of you, and there'll be very few of you who don't, Simon is a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts. He's a chartered director and a fellow of our own institute of consulting, the ICMCI, and indeed leads out on the CMC program, which we're very fortunate to have. He walks in both worlds. He co-owns the market and social research firm. I think it's called FMR, if memory serves me correctly. And also a great branding kind of entity called Consulting Mind Mastered, rather. Again, and that's really the provenance for where we're interested in having a chat with them today. Simon is the visiting professor in Durham University and the business school there, where he leads on the postgraduate work in strategy and consulting. And obviously being a management consulting institute, we're particularly keen and delighted to have him here, as he is also the program lead for strategy at the Institute of Directors, where he's a very frequent visitor to our colleagues in the IOD here in Ireland. So he also does some voluntary work, and he's an accredited strength scope practitioner. But ultimately, we're pleased, and Gramila Mahagat, as we say, Askelga Simon, for giving us your time, which is much appreciated. And I suppose really what I'll say to you folks is respectfully just maybe mute if you have some questions, put them into the chat box, and we'll pick them up at the end. We'll go live for a few minutes. Simon and myself are just going to kind of, I suppose, maybe have a fireside chat module here. And we're going to maybe do it thematically, as I was saying to Simon earlier, maybe get into the belly of the beast, perhaps, and maybe have a chat first, maybe get your thoughts, Simon, in terms of, let's dive right into the world of corporate boards, our mutual specialty. I mean, you know, you're seeing a lot of action out there. You're seeing a lot of different perspectives, a lot of different clients. So perhaps, Simon, maybe I could ask you to start us out by maybe sharing the latest trends that are shaping kind of boards today in terms of strategy, and maybe even, you know, be so bold as to ask you maybe to give us a little forecast where you see those uber super trends heading in the next 3 or 4 years.
Thank you. And in terms of the board level perspective of trends, maybe there's about 4.5 that I would put on the radar. The first is a progressive shift, as we know, towards the virtual enterprise. Many of us have built organizations with physical assets, and we're recognizing that as well as having a physical presence, the virtual presence is probably as important and forecast to become more important. So that transition to virtual enterprise, I think, is key. The second one is the ability of an organization to live in the world with progressive amount of black swans. And as we know, black swans, things which are unpredictable. And I think you make reference to our meeting right at the heart of the COVID situation there. And there's a view, and it's shared by one of my academic friends at Durham Business School, is that contemporary leadership is going from crisis to crisis to crisis. So things which are unanticipatable. So I think it's about how you design organizations to deal with a progressively unforecastable world. And then related to that is the shift from shareholder capitalism to stakeholder capitalism.
Yeah.
Now, in the private sector, as we know, I mean, the backstory is all about to prize the interest of the investor. And it served many economies and many organizations very well, but we're challenging that in so many parts of the world now. And I think in terms of that's not an easy transition for organizations to make and to embrace. And related then, this is the half one, is the greater impetus on organizations to be transparent. Because if one is going to do stakeholder capitalism, it's understanding the stakeholder maps and giving stakeholders a more present voice and understanding of the organization, so more transparency. And the final one, and this is nuanced by a conversation with a client earlier on today, the shift in governance perspective. So I have a client who is active globally, but owned by a very strong Chinese parent. And we would traditionally be in a world where the governance has been traditionally what we would review as Western. And I think progressively we will see challenges to that ethos. So the ability to embrace governance processes and board practices, which are very different to what we've been used to in the past.
Yeah, it certainly kind of finds great resonance what you're saying there in terms of the geopolitical situation and the kind of the shift, and I suppose the black swans that are regularly kind of taking flight at a really unprecedented pace. It's certainly we're seeing that, and that's not even to mention climate change and the evolution there. I mean, but from a board's perspective, to your point, when we talk about governance, I suppose, and risk management within that context, it seems to me there's often a tug of war with maybe innovation, which is key to kind of driving the machine forward. I mean, how do you think boards can find that sweet spot between being innovative and keeping things in check and compliance and so on?
Yeah, good one. Ray, it's great to see you on the call. And Ray, you and I share the charter directorship endorsement. And I suppose as a charter director, we would be very passionate about the appropriateness of governance for an organization. And I think the challenge here is to recognize that governance should neither stifle an organization, neither should it abdicate an organization's capabilities. And I'll give one example, and there are many more examples, but the view of McKinsey, and we know the brand, is McKinsey is now too big to be McKinsey, which is the governance process they have in place are now unable to control what McKinsey does in
Yeah.
various geographies. And so I think it's about enabling governance to develop and grow as the organization grows. And I think when we set in, many of us have set up businesses from nothing. You design a governance approach and it serves a point in time. But your first 3 years of a business is nothing like where you might be in 20 years' time. So I think the quality here is governance needs to be relevant for the organization we're trying to create. And that sweet spot between stifling and being over constrained and abdication, where we allowed things to go rogue and dangerously off piste, changes with the evolution of the organization. And many organizations don't get that, McKinsey being one.
Well, I mean, McKinsey is almost a textbook example of, that concept of too big to fail at the moment. They've really kind of become a super behemoth. And one of the challenges that we regularly get back or we hear from people is that whole piece that they struggle with, such as we are familiar with them in terms of succession planning and kind of keeping people in place and retention and so on. And that whole kind of element of, I suppose, keeping the machine fed with I suppose, an ongoing supply of quality candidates. I mean, and that same issue really kind of corresponds to what we're hearing from a governance point of view and the corporate space and succession planning, I suppose, to really kind of crystallize it. I suppose at the moment it's a bit like walking a tightrope for many organizations because even, the whole area of reputational risk is really kicking in terms of service on boards now and in terms of, I suppose, getting good caliber people. And there is that kind of, very quick rotation at the junior level. They're lasting 3 years and they're shipping out. And here in Ireland, we get a lot of it where a huge sway to the professional population of the younger cohorts coming out as MSCs to do 3 years and then they go off to Australia and America, which is right and proper, but it seems to be at a very high level. So maybe you could give us your take on how boards can and senior entities can handle this with kind of a degree of maybe finesse and hopefully with I suppose a smooth transition in terms of underpinning the long-term leadership stability of an organization.
If we make the assumption that the organization is in a sound enough place, and we're not dealing with a crisis situation, the organization is fundamentally sound. I think the first thing is not to replace too many people simultaneously. Because the loss of organizational memory at a senior level, the loss of momentum can be critical. And yeah, there were circumstances which led to it, but we will remember what happened to BP when it replaced both Peter Sutherland as chair and
Yeah.
John Brown as chief executive just before Deepwater Horizon happened, and the lack of senior level, board level quality to deal with something of that nature. So I think there's something about just having a program that we will replace on a structured basis rather than too many people at the same time. And then the second component is making sure that where we are going to with our board is future fit. And I think the three things which are perhaps now critical for anybody aspiring to senior board role. Digital literacy, the ability to understand, embrace sustainability. And the third one is the ability to be genuine when it comes to the equity, diversity, inclusion, belonging agenda. So irrespective of their functional expertise, so there might be a chief information officer or might be a chief financial officer on the board, whatever, irrespective of that perspective, I think digital literacy, the ability to comprehend genuinely the implications of sustainability and to embrace stakeholder capitalism and the ability to be able to communicate with the equity, diversity, inclusion, belonging agenda should be fundamentally on the tick list for anybody we consider to be a candidate.
Yeah, I mean, it's an extraordinary kind of evolution over the last, say, 5 years. And I think probably COVID leapfrogged that whole digital transformation piece by a factor of 5 to 7 years. We were going down that track anyways. But certainly the ESG train has become an Uber trend. I mean, sustainability seems to be on everyone's lips these days. And we've seen the CSRD regs coming, which will drive it further. But how do you think companies and organizations, beyond the talk and the greenwashing, can truly, I suppose, weave that sustainability into their core strategies from a strategic point of view to kind of actually embed it? I mean, what are your insights in terms of where the rubber hits the road there, as opposed to, my sense of it's a lot of greenwashing going on. There's a lot of talk about it, but real meaningful sustainability at core practice. How do you get to that in terms of your structure and your strategy?
Yeah, with difficulty. I run the sustainability program on behalf of the Institute directors, including the leading sustainability program in Ireland for IOD Ireland. And over the past 3 years, we have seen exactly what you described, which is tokenism. And we've seen the whole industry grow around the three letters ESG. And my view is ESG is all about optics. It is all about showing things to the world. And there's a lot of organizations trying to keep their noses clean and the way they present this to stakeholders. But the difference between ESG as optics and sustainability is not about the optics, but about the philosophy. And it's about that ability to be truly concerned about the relevance of your organization, the impact of your organization on the broader community of the planet Earth. So you can do it if the board wants to do it. And give you one example, and it's only an example that is relatively fresh. A conversation with On Post, and the organization, is when they were looking at shifting their transport fleet to electric, there was no business case. And the point I'm making here is our traditional model for making judgments in organizations is, do we see a return on investment? Can we see a business case? But if it's fundamentally ingrained in your philosophy and it's the right thing to do, then don't try and substantiate with the business case, because you're asking and answering the wrong question. So you start understanding what you need to do to your business model. And many of us on the call will be very familiar with the concept of the circular economy, what you do with finite materials, what you do with energy and such like. And the recreation fundamentally of business models sits really at the heart of it. And there's some very interesting organizations whose approach to sustainability is what I would consider as genuine rather than lip service. But I think we are not past the greenwashing. There's a whole, as I said, industry around ESG at the moment, and not necessarily in a healthy way.
No, I would find great resonance with what you're saying. And I always like that quote about, I suppose, the EDI element of it, which you also mentioned in terms of that authentic belief and embedding that. And what was the old saying that, diversity was inviting someone to the party, but inclusion was asking them to dance. Which I always thought had a nice resonance to it. I mean, but to your point about the ethics element of business conduct and indeed corporate governance, certainly to that point about transparency, are really becoming under more scrutiny at the moment. It's 24/7 scrutiny, and it's very much kind of reputational damage that people are aware of in that space. And we've seen a lot of it here in corporate Ireland recently. I mean, but what steps do you believe boards maybe should take, not just to comply with the letter of the law, but maybe move beyond that, to your point about embodying transparency and integrity and sustainability into the actual DNA of the organization? You know, if you were to take 1, 2, 3 steps.
Yeah, but the first thing is the recognition that you would expect a competent board and a competent director to go beyond the letter of the law. So an issue on ethics is not a legal issue.
Yeah.
It is about perspective. So you'd expect an organization to probably follow the principles of good ethical governance, the ability to be transparent, to do at any time what they consider to have the best maximum effect for the greatest number of people, which is why you have organizations who will spend money on product recalls globally, and discriminate in favor of the consumer, not the shareholder. And you'd expect an organization who behaves ethically to do what it considers to be fair. So our ability, how would we like to be treated ourselves?
Mm.
Now, those of us connected with global bodies understand the challenge, because what is ethically appropriate in one jurisdiction and geography is very, very different.
Yes.
And I would have many clients, and you'll have seen this, Pat, also, is in certain parts of the world, there are practices which are incredibly ingrained in the way that business development works, which just do not pass muster in what we would consider in it from a Western perspective. And these are neither right nor they are wrong. They just are. So one is the preparedness then for the board to go beyond the law and embrace, okay, to behave ethically is, okay, preparedness to do transparency, the effect and the fairness, and the ability then to have a stance. And this is not singling out organizations for any particular quality, but I do some work with a construction organization based in the UK who deliberately said, we will go nowhere near Saudi. And their view was that the practices in that country do not subscribe to their views on humanitarian custodianship. So if that's our perspective, that's our ethical standpoint, these are our principles, and this geography doesn't do it, therefore we will not work there. And to do that, you can imagine the sums of money they are leaving on the table. And so I think, yeah, so you embrace what ethics means, you have a policy on it, then the organization lives by that policy. And I'm always interested where organizations deliberately say no to the money because it's not the way we do things. And there are plenty of organizations who would be tokenistic around that rather than genuine. And this, yeah, I won't share the name of the organization, but they're okay. If these are our ethical principles and this particular jurisdiction doesn't do that, we will not work there.
Yeah, I mean, we're seeing that kind of very much through, I suppose, ethical investment and divestments, for instance, in oil over the last couple of years. And we've seen some of the big US American institutions over the last kind of year or two having huge portfolios and shifting away, and the impact that's had on shareholder meetings and so on. And equally, I suppose, more recently in terms of arms sales from a governmental point of view, where those arms are manufactured and where they're being used and so on. So it is a geopolitical, geo-global conundrum, and it goes back to culture as well. What is acceptable in one jurisdiction and what is kind of commonplace in another may not be necessarily cascading down through others. But I suppose you have to do what's right at the core. And again, it comes back to that cultural piece that you so eloquently put. I mean, this is how we do things around here. And this is what our expectations are of what right is and wrong is. And it is, I suppose, something that you can sense, certainly from an organization at its beating heart. And you get that sense that that's the sort of organization you'd like to work for, I would imagine, as well, or not, depending on how they go about their business. And I suppose, you mentioned earlier that huge beast that we're living through at the moment in terms of, if we could just touch on it, for example, at the moment, that digital transformation piece. And it was already going at pace, and then AI jumped, leapfrogged rather, into the belly of the beast, and that rapid pace. I mean, surely, you're seeing it a lot in terms of, what challenges and opportunities are you seeing out there in terms of that space? And I know that's a very broad question, but when you look at it strategically, how do you think boards should be framing the questions they should be asking about AI and how they integrate it and how the organizations should integrate it, given the ethical questions that are being thrown up now?
Yeah, I think in terms of historically, when we take on board new technologies, you're familiar with the Gartner hype circle.
Yeah.
The things can get overhyped to start with, and then there's a disillusionment that then comes from the fact that the hyping didn't deliver our expectations, and then we settle down into something that then reshapes the way we do things. And so the Gartner hype cycle is based on a retrospective look back. And okay, the look back doesn't always predict the future. But I think any competent organization, any competent board, and any competent management consultant is as on the pace as they can be when it comes to AI. It will change the way that consulting works. It will change the way that organizations do what they do. And we better be prepared to accept this is going to be the journey. Now, what we don't know is how, but what we do realize, what we don't do is wait for the answer before we jump. So we become part of the process. We experiment with the technologies. With my consultancy hat, I use very straightforward AI to the benefit of clients, and it just saves a whole chunk of time, which is client resource, such like. And similarly with their organizations, the way we would have analyzed data in the past to give guidance would be very different to the way we'd look at it in the future.
Yeah.
And we're to the situation now that we can, with sufficient data, you can almost dial in guidelines for what an organization's strategy should be. Now, there's all kinds of issues to do with that in terms of the quality of the data, the hallucinations that AI flags up. But boy, does it sharpen the questions and areas for further research. So it is an area of importance for both the supply side of consulting and the client side of board. I think so that my take is particularly on artificial intelligence.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. We're seeing a lot of it and a lot of questions being asked. We have maybe three different cohorts in the institute here, as you'd be familiar, Simon. I mean, you have the big practices, if you wish, and then you have the small to medium size, and then you have the independent kind of consultants and so on. And sorry, there's obviously the fourth underpinning all that are the acorns, the graduate students who are coming up through as well. So we have that fourth element, that fourth pillar. I suppose the feedback we're seeing a little bit maybe is that there's emerging at a rate of knots an uber niche management consultancy as a consequence of AI, that people are becoming very niche in their areas. If they're not in the big consulting practices with that cloak around them in terms of protection because of client feed and ongoing kind of relationship management and so on. So for the smaller ones, there seem to be going to a more uber niche space and very much specializing in that area. Now, I suspect that was the case anyways, and they were going that way. And then I suppose the aspect of AI in terms of data integration and interrogation has become significant as well. So it's taking a lot of the legwork out of it, but it still requires, I suppose, good eyes to look at that kind of output and prepare it and present it in a meaningful fashion with proposals and recommendations to the client at the end of the day. I think probably the issue as well is there's so much AI out there. It's like a forest at the moment. It's a blizzard of AI opportunities, and people are getting a little bit tired, if you want. There's a little bit of AI fatigue already kicking in because every time you open up something, there's another element of AI. But I think you're right. I think it's with us for the duration. And we've seen, obviously, on the medical side, there's some huge leaps and advantages to it as well. Our own sense of it when we talk about it here, I suspect, it is a prompting tool, to your point as well. It aids very good conversations. And if you're suffering from writer's block as well, I think perhaps sometimes it can kickstart you over that piece, that lacuna that you might be suffering from. But as I say, it all comes down to disruption, and we are in the business of as management consultants, kind of managing and surfing the whole area of disruption, and that's why we exist to a certain degree, if we're honest about it. And from your vantage point, I mean, how do you think organizations can champion that business model of innovation, not just to survive, but truly kind of thrive and flourish and move forward? That whole innovation piece from a management consultancy. If you harvest all that out there that I've just said, I mean, what's your takeaway on that?
It's I think the contrast between surviving and flourishing is an interesting one. And I think when you talk about organizational health, you have survivability on one side and then thriving and flourishing on the other side. And as you manage an organization, you are somewhere on that spectrum, hopefully, and not always on the flourishing side of
Mm.
it and thriving side of things. So it's managing that journey. I think in terms of the client side and thinking about boards and harnessing the disruption piece, the problem for organizations is every organization are the history of their own future. And so they are imprisoned by the decisions they've made in the past. We become path dependent. And so given a blank sheet of paper, there's all kinds of things we could do, but we can't really,
Okay.
because that's the real estate we've purchased. These are the people we've spent decades training. This is the culture we've assimilated. Try unpicking that lot. And so I think there's an element we can see a lot where a lot of the corporates will allow the entrepreneurs to be the fountain of disruption. You see it in banking and finance, where the bright young fintech will create something, and then out comes the corporate checkbook, and they become part of the corporate network. You see
Yeah.
it in technology, and Microsoft would be incredibly strong at harnessing entrepreneurial technology outside of its own four doors, and also then corralling it itself. So I think organizations understand what they can do, and also a bright board understands what it can't do in that respect. Yeah.
As Clint Eastwood famously said, a man's got to know his limitations. And speaking within that context of kind of being self-aware and kind of that whole corporately self-aware, and to your earlier point about leadership and so on. I mean, we're coming out of a tunnel, out of Brexit, for example, out of COVID, hopefully, for example, although it's still with us. We have, a European theater at war, which we hadn't forecast, unfortunately, and the Middle East is in turmoil. So, I mean, we are in a black swan, certainly kind of. We're in a lot of black swans around the place. So, I mean, if ever there was a time when leadership has become really critical, and, even within the political spectrum here in Ireland, it has changed completely within the last, week, for example, a week or two. We have new leadership in place there. So, I mean, self-evidently, leadership at times of crisis is critical. I mean, knowing what you know and having seen what you've seen, Simon, could you maybe share with us your perspective in terms of maybe, the essential qualities that leaders need in this, rapidly evolving crisis-led environment, to navigate? It's a little bit different, I suspect, in terms of what was required 20, 30 years ago in terms of the qualities of leadership that people now need now. And I know you mentioned kind of, that digital literacy and I suppose that awareness of ESG earlier, and I suppose EDI and so on. But I suppose I'm really asking you about CEO level leadership here.
Yeah, I mean, there's some fundamentals that haven't shifted. So when leadership, as we know, is galvanized on this picture of a future. So leadership is future focused, and leaders provide energy to situations so that they facilitate things happening. And I think that stays with us. But it's about that ability to lead in a complex world where there is no formula that sorts it. No matter what data you put into the algorithm, it doesn't give you an answer. And this ability to recognize that humanics, the ability to bring a diverse group of people along with you, really plays to what we're looking for of leadership in the future. And I think you're right that individuals who might have succeeded 30 years ago at the top end of organizations might feel a little bit uncomfortable in the type of situations that we find ourselves with today. And it takes us to what does it look like? So complexity, how do you work in complexity? By the ability to be part of it, to sense, to react, to be prepared to change. And when one is prepared to change, it's not viewed as a failure that you got it wrong in the first place. It just says that we now have more information. So it becomes more of a verb, something one does, rather than the roadmap from A to B, because we don't know what that roadmap looks like. So it is the complexity thing, the fluidity of it I think is fundamentally to how we lead an organization in contemporary times.
No, I mean, it's I suppose as old as Methuselah in terms of what makes a great leader. Are they born or are they bred, or is it a composite of both? I think the core skill set comes back to energy, a little bit of vision, that awareness that ships were not built to stay in port, that they have to have a little bit of risk appetite as well. And I suppose bringing it all together, that they get them ideally with a little bit of luck. Napoleon would have said, what does he look for in his generals? And he said, above all other things, luck was what he looked for in his generals. So there's a combination, I think, and also, I suppose, a grounding as well in terms of practical experience, perhaps having a few scars on the back, and technical knowledge sufficient onto the needs of the organization or entity that you're leading. Just conscious of time, and I suppose our colleague Kathy asked a question which I should have picked up earlier, so forgive me, Kathy. I mean, just going back for a second in terms of the whole thing about her question was, do you think one of the issues around greenwashing is a lack of clarity regarding, for example, expectations and or common definitions, and how could that be addressed? And sorry, if anyone else has any questions, please drop them into the chat box. And I've also, just to conclude that monologue, I've also put a link to our next session in the chat box as well.
Yeah, Kathy, thank you. And yes, I do. And I think compounded with the lack of clarity is also a human characteristic of the willingness or the unwillingness to accept a message. Now, in my life, there'll be certain brands that I favor and certain brands that I probably wouldn't give house room to. And if a brand that I favor says something, I'm inclined to take it at face value or see it more optimistically. Or if there's an organization I've got a downer on, if they say something, I'll be critical to it. So I think in terms of the whole greenwashing side of things, the area we're most precise is carbon footprint. But we can't necessarily agree what carbon neutral genuinely means. So even when we get precise data, there are fudges around the interpretation of the definition. And if you put that on top of human bias, the way we look more positively at some organizations than others, it goes into this. I run a 42-year-old car. And the reason I do that is my fundamental belief is we should challenge consumerism and hang on to things as long as possible. So that's my view on things. And one of my academic friends, who's a professor of the circular economy, she quoted some research on what to do with washing machines and white goods in the household. And the question she was asked is, okay, I've got a washing machine that's been in the house for 12 years. Should I get rid of it and replace it by a 2024 model, which has wonderful ecological performance? And the research showed was if you're looking for impact on the planet, stay faithful to your old machine. It might boil more water, it might use more detergent, but you are not using new materials and energy to create it. Now, the problem is, I've now used that as an endorsement to legitimize my 42-year-old car. And so the point I'm making is you got these data points, but human beings will put our own spin on it. Yeah, and we don't know enough to know what the right answers really are or aren't.
Thank you. And there's another question in there from Kevin, and I suppose it's really kind of, I suppose, to that beating heart of business continuity planning and resilience. And he indicates that he read a book recently. So I suppose he's arguing about strategy and kind of embedding within strategy the allowance for periodic shocks to build that in. Any views on that, that they're inevitable?
Yeah, Kevin, totally. And thank you. I was with a client yesterday, and I was asked a very, very similar question, or asked to illuminate on a very similar point, and I quoted some research. And the research is under the umbrella of a book published under the title of The Living Company. And the research looked at organizations who had existed for centuries. Now, there are some in Europe, there's some in Latin America, and there's some in Asia of organizations that have seen an awful lot. And what the research team did was look across geographies, look across organizations, and look for common themes. And if you want your organization to last for a long time, there are 4 themes. Number 1, you're very clear on your identity. What does that mean? You've got that sense of purpose and values and know who you are. Number 2, you are sensitive to the external world. So you can appreciate how the world might be changed. Number 3, you're tolerant of new ideas. So just because the world is changing doesn't mean you've got open ears to it. But the point that you raise chimes with the 4th point. If you want your organization to live for a long time, you are very conservatively financed, which means you never bet the house, you never bet the farm. And to quote my 91-year-old auntie, who when myself, my brother, and my sister were very little, she used to give us the advice, save money for a rainy day. And the idea was, okay, don't know when it's going to rain, but it's going to rain. So once we accept that external shocks and crises are inevitable, you design business models to accommodate that. So conservative finance means there is always reserves, there is always capacity to cope with the unforecastable. And I think a question for any board is this: how resilient do you want your organization to be? Because if you're going to pay out everything to an investor, everything to a shareholder, you won't have the reserves, and you might sparkle in the short term, but you're probably condemning yourself to a short life. And the organizations that live for centuries manage to be unspectacular in terms of financial returns at a short point in time. But guess what? They're still here. So your point about almost the inevitability of external shocks, totally agree with that. And the solution is not a difficult one, providing we're prepared to embrace it.
Simon, on that note, I would say to you, thank you so much for your time. It's been a really, really insightful chat. I have to say thank you on behalf of all that are here and those that will watch it later on YouTube. You really shared some deep, granular thoughts with us, and a lot of it found deep resonance, certainly with myself, and I'm sure I can speak for the rest of the audience as well. I look forward perhaps to breaking bread with you in the near future when you're over. And on behalf of everyone, I just want to say thank you. I put a note in for the guys for our next module coming up, with one of our confreres from UCC. But for the rest of you, we can release you back into the wild. And we have it within the timeline. I think we said 40 minutes, so we're just on the nail. Simon will be able to grab a cup of soup and get back to the day job. So thank you. And if you have any questions or anything like that, please feel free to come back to us. But really appreciate your time, Simon. It means a lot. I know how busy you are. So have a great day, and we'll talk again soon. Bye, everyone. And we'll send
Thank you. Great to see you, folks. All the best.
Bye.